Welcome to Leaders and Legends, the podcast focused on leadership and clinical trial execution. I'm your host, Patty Leuchten, CEO of Diligent Pharma. In each episode, we'll get to know the individuals who are driving change and influencing the direction of our industry. Whether you're a seasoned executive yourself, an emerging leader, or simply passionate about clinical trials like I am, join us as we discuss our industry's most pressing challenges, the future of clinical trials, and hear insights and advice from the leaders who are moving our industry forward. Ken, thank you so much for joining the Leaders and Legends podcast.
It is so great to be here, Patty. I've been looking forward to this.
Me too. Well, I think of you as someone who almost needs no introduction. You're so well known in the industry and respected for all the things you've done, but particularly the work you're doing with, the Tufts Center for the study of drug development. But in this conversation, I also want to explore your entrepreneurial pursuits, the founding of CenterWatch, the founding of CISCRP, what led you to starting those organizations. And I think that a good way to set the stage is maybe to back up even further and have you talk a little bit about where you grew up and where you went to college and how that led you into your work.
First off, it's great to take that step back because from my perspective, all of the pieces that you touched on actually fit a pretty clear path on this journey. I grew up west of Boston in a town called Sudbury. And I went to college at Brandeis University. I was a pre-med major and also an economics major. And I started a business while I was an undergrad.
Oh, I didn't know that. What was that? What was that business?
Basically, I went out and got day-old bagels and sold them to students who were looking for food while they were studying for exams and preparing papers, and it kind of took off. And I really enjoyed that experience. So ultimately, coming out of college, I started to sort of think about what direction to take. Should I continue to pursue the sciences or maybe some more of my entrepreneurial leanings? And I ended up in consulting. And it was there that most of the projects I was on were tied to science, but all associated with the management of science. So very early on, I was involved with projects looking at what was called clinical research fast tracking, how to move a drug through a clinical trial and stay on the critical path and avoid digression, avoid any activity that might stray from the most critical activities. It was very popular in the 1980s, and that kind of got me hooked in the whole clinical research space.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that says so much because I could see the linkages with just about everything that I know of that you've pursued, both with CenterWatch, with CISCRP, with the research at Tufts. And so help me with the timing of the founding of both CenterWatch and CISCRP, because I'm kind of fuzzy on that.
So I was in management consulting through the early 90s, 1991 or so, 1992. And It was then when I actually founded two companies. I had a software company that was developing, this was pre-internet, if you can believe it, that was developing a site selection tool. And I started CenterWatch as a way of basically taking management consulting to the masses. If anybody who knew anything about the work I was doing in consulting, I was basically doing studies and then summarizing insights based on the data we had gathered and sharing it back to the professionals who had hired us, or with CenterWatch, it was just sharing it broadly with the industry as a whole. So the publishing became kind of an important way to bring consulting on the management of clinical trials and clinical research science to a broader audience.
Oh, wow.
And both businesses I was able to sell. The software company I sold to a CRO before it really even started to scale. There was a company that saw the product and was interested.
Mm.
And CenterWatch, I grew. I spent about 10 years growing the company, and then I sold it to Medical Economics, which was part of Thomson Reuters, Thomson Publishing.
And what roughly like what year was that you sold to Thomson Reuters?
It was 1998.
Okay.
And
All
I then
right.
stayed with CenterWatch for another 5 years and basically led strategy in the sort of health sciences and medical sciences group at Thomson Reuters. Uh, and that was part of my employment agreement when I sold CenterWatch. I stayed with
Hmm.
the organization. While I was there and now that I had sold the company, we noticed that we were getting so many letters and inquiries from patients who wanted to see the same data we were publishing for pharma and for uh, drug development and clinical research professionals. And we sensed it, I sensed, as did many of my colleagues, that there was sort of an untapped
Right.
market for patient education. And that's what led to the formation of CISCRP. So CISCRP
Okay.
became almost like a CenterWatch like arm to educate and advocate for patients in clinical research. And that's how those two.
Okay, so that's interesting, that connection.
And
And
something that I think you'll find really interesting. You may recall that Time magazine in 2002 ran a cover story that showed a woman in a hospital gown sitting in a dog crate. And the title of the cover story was How Clinical Research is Turning Millions of Us into Guinea Pigs. And yeah,
was not aware of that. I should be, but that's fascinating.
that was the impetus for starting CISCRP. I had been watching patient interest. What stunned me is that no one in industry, no one in clinical research stepped forward and said, how dare you depict
Yes.
patient as just a an undignified, vulnerable party here. These are people who are giving this courageous gift of participation. And so I started CISCRP really to counter a lot of what I was seeing in the
Oh,
media and this very, very negative view of people who choose to participate in clinical trials.
well, in some ways that view is still out there, right? I mean, what a horrible image, and images tend to stick in people's, hearts and minds, more so than words. And um, I it's interesting because I'm not sure that pharma companies have been intentional and focused on actually trying to combat that negative image. I mean, it's improved obviously over the last several years, and with the more the focus on patients and patients as partners, and bringing patients into the process. But there is still negative connotations.
I
And
couldn't more, and it's sort of a frustration. It's a disappointment for me. We've had
yeah,
the patient engagement movement for 15 years, and I
yeah.
think generally there isn't a single person in our research enterprise or even broadly who doesn't agree that patients need to be partners in the process. But we still have not really moved the needle, and it's to your point, there are moments like during COVID when I really felt that all that additional media coverage would
Yeah.
elevate research literacy and engender
Mhm.
more public trust. It hasn't happened. So it's clearly just such a massive challenge. And I think now with social media and so much divisiveness and misinformation, right? It's getting even harder to influence
Yes.
public perception.
I agree. Yeah. I want to talk about both CenterWatch and CISCRP individually. But as you were talking, I don't know, a thought occurred to me about the power of data and information to wake people up, to wake, senior executives up in terms of shining a light on challenges and inspiring change. And I wonder if you think about data in that way, both with the work you've done with CenterWatch, with CISCRP, and also now with your work at the Tufts Center. So, and of course, I've been passionate about that as well.
It,
So
it's
talk
really
about that a little bit.
It's really a passion that we share, and I'm so glad you brought it up. That's what motivates me, Patty. I have seen firsthand the power that data and evidence can have, and although often it may tell a story or suggest insights that are not comfortable
Right.
for us, it is
Yeah.
remarkable how the role that it can play. And I've just really been so fortunate that I've gravitated toward roles where I can autonomously and objectively gather data to share and influence and help tell the story with hard data and
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly important place. It's one that really motivates me. It's a big responsibility, as you know from your work. There are times when you really have to go that extra distance to feel comfortable that the data you're sharing is capturing a perspective that's worth sharing, that's worth informing.
Yes, it is so important. And you have, as you said, it's almost like you also have to, um, really ensure that the quality of the data is very high, that the research methods are sort of, you know, uh, like almost like you have to take a pristine approach to gathering the data because sometimes the results are controversial, right? But it's interesting. I've had this experience where you see light bulbs going off, where people can almost they have a visceral feeling of what's happening, but then when something important is described through the lens of quantitative and qualitative data, I've experienced this in presenting data and working with executives that you could see the shift happen, right? So, but often there is this dynamic of wanting to shoot the messenger, so to speak. And I'm wondering if that I've experienced it in different ways where just you ruffle feathers or there's sort of it's not comfortable, the shining of, putting a light on either challenges or issues or disconnects. Have you experienced that?
Yes, and I would say I really have, and I would say that it's early on it was a challenge, but it became an opportunity. Let me explain. Early on, CenterWatch started gathering data from sites rating the best and worst CROs and sponsors to work with. That was sort of
I remember.
one of the things that
Yes.
put
Yeah.
CenterWatch on the map. The very first report card survey that we published, one of the top CROs called me and threatened to sue
Oh,
me personally. And that was one of those moments when I had to explain to them that they're kind of shooting the messenger here. And if they really took a hard look at the data, they'd see that there are some real opportunities for improvement. There are some real insights. I'm happy to say they never sued me, and
yes.
with the hair
That's
movement. But over time, because I was protected as an independent publisher, and then when I moved into academia, I was able to really create an even wider runway for me to maintain that objectivity and autonomy, and it's worked so well.
yes.
And now I think people generally are much more trusting of data that comes from us. But in the early years, CenterWatch faced so many challenges and headwinds from organizations
Mm.
not like the story we were telling.
Interesting. I had a similar experience. You may recall the work we did to characterize the quality of clinical trials back in 2011. This was when I was leading Avoca. And the data was pretty provocative, with CROs sort of self-assessing themselves as, you know, driving the highest level of quality, and pharma companies having a totally sort of different view, not as positive. And I remember talking with a senior executive at one of the top CROs, and she said, this industry is challenging enough, Patty. There's a lot of competition, and it doesn't really help. The work you're doing just isn't helping us. And I was so taken aback because of course, we're not an independent academic institution, but we were driving an objective, independent process where we were gathering data from both sides, not just the CROs or not just the pharma companies. But those kind of conversations that actually, even though in the moment it's difficult, I think that they help you become sort of even better and even more intentional about how to describe what you're doing and why. Um, and our interest, as we talked about, was to help drive change. And I think that's been a common thread with the work you're doing as well. And I just wonder, with the CenterWatch studies, do you think it actually helped to inspire higher quality and better management of sites? And like, was it sort of an impetus for companies to get to that top level?
I certainly hope it played.
Yeah.
Um, I think that there are professionals who sort of grew up and started their career at a time when more of that data and evidence was circulating. So I do think that these are people who I think are more aware of metrics and data that we
Mm,
other to sort of assess how they're doing and to identify opportunities to optimize their performance.
hmm.
I hope that
Yeah.
of all of the outcomes of the work that we've done, that if it has helped to sort of elevate the performance and the quality of the work that's being done, then that is such a great outcome and one that we've always aspired to deliver.
Yeah. I think about that with benchmarking too. Like when you're looking at either specific categories of clinical research, not necessarily specific companies, but if you're looking at, quality and trends within subsets of the clinical trial process, and maybe the data isn't that positive, I would imagine that the companies, the clinical service providers that are out there, they want to hit a high bar. They want to be better than average, right? So publishing that data, I think, has an impact of inspiring companies to really take a look at it vis-a-vis how they're operating, and then make some intentional choices to drive higher quality. And that
Uh,
I think there is the potential to do that even more in our industry.
I really appreciate those comments, and I completely am aligned with them. I have to say that there are times when it has really struck me that bringing that kind of story to people and showing the hard data is both a blessing and a curse. There have been times when I've been invited to speak at a company, and when they introduce me, they will say something like, "I hate." I hate this person because he always tells us about how badly we're doing, right?
Well, you
The
tell the
data,
truth, right?
right?
Yes.
The data is always only moving in one direction, right? timelines are getting longer, our protocols are more complex.
Yeah.
Or others that will always say he's a broken record, but we love to hear what he has to say, and we love to see the latest data. So clearly, people are aware of that. I There's just no shortage of places to show with benchmarks, as you noted, other areas where we could improve. And if that's the role that my team and I play, and that you and your colleagues have played, well, then I'm happy to play that role.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, it's interesting. As I moved into academia after selling CenterWatch, I I felt that I needed to be even more transparent about what would happen to the results of a study, any study, positive or negative. So in every contract, we make it clear that we plan to publish. And I remember the heads of the medical school thought that that would turn away a lot of potential sponsors.
Oh,
Had the
interesting.
opposite effect. It had the opposite effect because I think generally people do, even though it might be painful,
Yeah.
they do put a premium on hard data that's been gathered thoughtfully, as you noted, where there's real integrity in the research that's been performed. And so to everybody's credit, although they may make a face when I mention to them that we will be publishing this positive or negative, that
Yeah.
everybody kind of rallies behind that.
Yeah. And well, I think that's really important because without publishing the data and keeping it within a very small group, it doesn't have the same kind of reach and influence and impact. And um, I'm sure there's no way of really knowing what the impact is, but some of the data, particularly coming out of Tufts, has been so influential that I would imagine that it's inspired even new businesses to launch and innovation within, uh, organizations to address some of the challenges that have been sort of published by the Tufts Center. And I wonder if, like, I have in my mind a couple data points that I just know just from seeing you present. But what are some of the more sort of kind of um, often quoted results that have come out of the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development?
There are quite a few, and by the way, thank you for those comments. The For a long time, the center's work on the cost to develop a single successful drug, that $2.6 billion figure, which is
Yes.
10 years old and out of date. We're updating that. That's been
Hmm.
widely published and has been the subject of a lot of other studies that have tried to challenge that figure. So that's another thing that we like about our research, is that if it can stimulate follow-up studies, response studies, that's the
Yeah.
whole intent of the data. My studies are quite a few areas that are often quoted. All the protocol complexity work, which is now, we've been doing that work for
Yes.
25 years.
Hmm.
That generally gets a lot of really strong resonance. Our work on protocol amendments, which was
Oh,
kind of a
yes.
new area.
I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in, sitting around the table with people. Well, it's a $500,000 for every amendment. Now, it might be more than that
According
now,
to, um,
but
I mean, that's one of the few studies where I've been like in a foreign country giving a talk, and someone will rush the stage afterward with a copy of that paper, dog eared,
Mm.
all bent up, and they want me to autograph it. So that I know
Wow,
is getting some track. You know, there have been
that's
quite
very
a
funny.
few. We just did a study on the value of a day of delay, and
Oh, interesting.
and
Because early days when I was in business development I worked at Besselar, I worked at Pharmaco in the day, I'm dating myself now. That was always a data point that was mentioned in business development meetings to talk about how can if you work with us, we can help expedite clinical trials. And here's the impact,
right
right?
here, right, just the value of time that we're saving.
Right, the value of time.
So
Yeah.
that's exactly the impetus behind this study. I was at a meeting and a BD professional went up and talked about the number of days that this solution would save. And he then suggested that if it was $4 million a day 10 years ago, if we inflate that figure, it must be worth $7 million a day today. And I thought to myself that I don't buy it. Let's look at the actual
Yeah.
data. And what we showed is that the value of a day is now worth about 20% of what it was worth during the blockbuster era.
Oh,
That the
very
value of a
interesting.
day is then
Okay.
declining because we're targeting more narrowly defined patient populations, rare disease
Gotcha.
communities. So it's actually moving in the opposite direction at the same time that the risk in clinical research is rising, which is the
Uh-huh.
most perverse relationship. Risk is increasing, reward or return is declining. So that
Yes.
I often talk about that now and what we need to do to address that.
Well, the other data point that I've seen, well, you present, I have presented it as well, full disclosure, and I've seen others present this data, is the number of years it takes for a new innovation to come into its own in clinical trials. And we worked a little bit together on
Yes,
that
that was a great
adoption of
project.
innovation study.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's really struck a chord with so many. I think because they've all lived this, right? They all often wonder why did it take so long.
yeah.
I think that study that we worked on together really helped to just put some real timelines around it and what are some of the critical steps that need to take place to transition from one part of the process to the next.
Right. Well, I think that with that study, one of the things that was striking is that we're pursuing some very novel, interesting things now through, leveraging AI and other modern tech tools with innovation. Um, in that study, you looked at something as straightforward as like EDC and, you know, um, you know, just e-consent, things that aren't kind of mind-blowing in terms of complexity, yet the amount of time is still so protracted. So when you think about anything that's super complex or that requires new skills to incorporate into your company, it seems very daunting in light of that data.
Yeah, and I also use it to talk about the COVID pandemic's necessity to adopt virtual and remote solutions. And as soon as the pandemic was behind us, most companies completely retrenched their adoption of many of these approaches. And, I think that was an example of sort of skipping critical steps, like the gathering of hard data that would inform a clearer understanding of the ROI.
The ROI.
Right.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
for many, that was kind of a comforting, although not a happy outcome
Right.
that the pandemic became sort of a grand pilot study, but we're still in pilot mode now. In some
Perpetual pilot mode is the phrase
the
that
phrase, right?
I'm hearing. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So interesting because the burning platform of COVID inspired innovation adoption. And, there was many people or many executives saying, this is the new normal now. We're, going to be working with more, speed and a focus on new ways of working to drive efficiency and, higher quality. But then the sort of reverting back. Do you have a sense of that just from, I know you describe yourself as an observer in our industry. You're not working in the industry, but do you have a sense for why that there was that sort of reverting back to the sort of pre-pandemic ways?
I do. I have, and this could be such a lengthy discussion.
I know
Um,
this is not the path that I thought we would go down, but I'm
uh,
like fascinated by this and what you have to say. So,
well, you may recall that there was right when the pandemic hit, there was the no going back movement.
Yes.
Hashtag no going back, and
Yes.
the people signed it. And
Right.
I remember the group that was looking to kind of promote the movement came to us at the center and said, "We want Tufts CSDD to sign this statement." And our response was, we just don't do that, right? We don't
Right.
step into that.
Yeah.
In the back of my mind, I was thinking though that innovation never it's not ever faith-based, right? It's only going to work when you have at least relatively clear evidence to prompt a company to move forward. And we still have not gathered a sufficient amount of data, right? Many organizations still don't collect the right data, or there's too much noise in the data, so that they really don't have a clear,
Yeah.
and they also are learning more, right? The original impetus for remote and virtual technology adoption was to address an untenable situation. Sites were not able to continue their studies. They couldn't allow anyone on site.
Right.
I think sponsors started to realize that there's just so much going on here that we need to understand before we thrust some of
Yeah.
these approaches on sites and on patients. So now it's much more intentional and deliberate, but we don't have the data to support more customized approaches that will leverage these solutions.
It's I well, I think it's sort of a takeaway for me from this conversation. It's so important, and, I think it's hard too for companies to both be driving innovation, but also having this meta view of the ROI and making sure that, that they're making the right choices in terms of what to incorporate in terms of innovations and new tech, and so it's even more reason for the importance of independent organizations to be gathering hard evidence, qualitative and quantitative data, and having really good case studies that companies are willing to share.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's been a
That
big problem in so many emerging areas, right?
yes,
Technologies and solutions. It is such a tough environment, I imagine, for new ventures when they're trying to educate a market, and you're not seeing the case studies being shared, and there's so much skepticism and risk aversion, right, which we have to constantly counter when you're offering an innovation.
totally. Yeah. And I think that when you are, for these emerging companies, there is this interest in being first to market and also, not necessarily being sort of concerned about competition. But I think actually competition opens markets. And as you know, I'm a big fan of consortia and the sharing of information so that others can learn and adopt and adapt faster than they otherwise would have. And I know that you're involved in a lot of consortia as well. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about that a little bit, just the role of consortia
Yeah.
to sort of
And, and
support this.
I'm happy to. And I will say, Patty, you were really a pioneer, especially in the
Oh, thank
quality area,
you.
recognizing that a consortium approach was kind of the best way in a pre-competitive environment to get a group of organizations together, roll up their sleeves, and really share data, collaborate, share insights. So
Thank you.
we've done basically we sort of took the playbook from the quality consortium. We were approached by Sanofi a number of years ago to look at sponsor company patient advocacy group collaborations, and why are these collaborations always feeling like they're reinventing the wheel every time they start?
Hmm.
Why are there no lessons learned or best practices that could be shared? And so we launched Paladin 3 years ago with about 25 companies and PAGs and pharma. And it's just continued to thrive. And we've moved now from pulling together resources and frameworks and now sort of checklists and a lot of the same things that you did.
Great.
Quality Consortium. Now we're gathering case studies and metrics to actually evaluate whether a particular collaboration really fits the bill as a successful one that we can learn from and we can codify and then share the insights. And then the other consortium we started is called PACT. This was started about a year and a half ago. We received funding from the Reagan-Udall Foundation and Medable to create essentially a pre-competitive collective of companies that would share their experiences, actual experiences with remote and virtual technologies and practices. And in our first year, we collected data from about 70 trials, and we're now continuing to expand that data set. We're using it purely empirical data to sort of show if there are certain combinations of solutions that are predictive of a particular patient community participating in a trial by disease condition and geographic location. So
Interesting.
as the data
Yeah.
set grows, it will be very, very, I think, very informative and on really how to customize and how to be very, very intentional and strategic in what kind of technology and approaches we use to support our protocols.
I think that's awesome. I really do. That's great. I think, just when we started the consortium, it actually was from a feeling of feeling a little frustrated seeing so many companies working in silos, struggling with the same things. And it all came out from looking at the data. When you see trends in data that of common issues, common industry challenges, and yeah, and even getting a group of people together to discuss these things has an impact. So it sounds like you're, really hitting some very important areas with those two consortia. So that's great.
And the passion in these groups is really remarkable. I mean, I think the AQC started to take on a life of its own, right? You really had people so committed and almost looking to start their own little side work streams,
Oh
and
yeah,
you reach that point.
yeah. It did. I think what was really interesting is that when we would gather, the conversations would always inspire like a new sub area to dive into. And then it almost, people would self-select to get involved in the work streams. And we always tried to be very practical in terms of creating tools and templates and things that could actually be incorporated. And so, yeah, it's nice to hear that you're engaged in that work as well. As you know, I'm a big fan of it. And I wanted to, we went down in a very interesting tangent. But I want to just take a step back because I'm very curious if you're willing to talk about it. Just this journey with CenterWatch, because my understanding is you were with Thomson Reuters, but then am I correct in the statement that you actually bought the company back? Is that correct?
Yes. In
So,
other
just from a business standpoint, I'm kind of curious about
uh,
that, if you're willing to talk about it.
it happens so often. It's actually called founder's disease or founder's dilemma. After I sold CenterWatch and after my 5-year employment contract had ended, I sort of moved out of the corporate world and into the nonprofit world. And at the time, interestingly, I had an offer to join a corporate leadership team at one of the top CROs.
Okay.
But I just felt I did not want to compromise my independence and
Yeah.
my love of having that vantage point, really being that observer. And so I ended up getting approached by Tufts University, which was marvelous, and I started CISCRP.
Okay.
And I was there for about 5 years when I just noticed that CenterWatch had stopped really serving what I thought were its primary focus. The needs of this market were not being met with original research. The quality of the publication I felt had really suffered, and I just basically approached uh, the company that had acquired the asset from Thompson. It had moved to another
Oh, I
company.
see.
And I basically offered them the chance to unload the asset before it lost its value completely. That was my pitch to them.
Yeah.
Amazingly, they said, "All right, we're all ears," and sold it to me. Sold it back to me.
That is so
So,
fascinating to me. I mean, having, obviously been a founder of two companies, I think that it speaks volumes to me about your passion for making a difference. It's not just sort of like, oh, I had a transaction and then, whatever happens, happens. It's not my problem anymore, right? You were watching and frustrated that the company you started wasn't reaching its potential, right? And I think, yeah, that's really interesting and a very unique experience to buy your company back. Can you talk just for a minute about that transition of now you have your organization back? Was it a whole new group of different people? Was it the same people?
it was there were a few people that were still there from the company that I had sold to Thompson, but then I had to hire back some people to
I
manage.
see.
And at this point, I was not an active part of the company. I was now basically the investor and board member. It had its own management team. So I had my day job at Tufts University. I was the board chair at CISCRP and a meddlesome volunteer. And CenterWatch had its own management team, and I met with them often a couple times a week. I would exchange emails, and then we would have quarterly meetings where I would meet with the leadership team.
So interesting. And what a great opportunity to be able to do that and have your role at Tufts. Sometimes that's just not uh, in the cards to be able to, engage in other entrepreneurial pursuits when you have a very serious, important job. So
Yeah,
that's,
thank
yeah,
you. At the university, it's interesting. They encourage all faculty to have a connection to the private sector and to venture work.
I see.
A lot of the medical faculty have patents that they make
Hmm.
sense to a venture, and then they serve on the board, or some of them even take an investment in an equity position. So it was really not hard to convince the medical school that this was a valuable opportunity. For people who were really fans of CenterWatch, they probably also noticed that more of the articles in CenterWatch started to cover Tufts Center research when I bought it back, because there was that really good synergy as well. We were
Oh,
doing
yeah.
large scale studies, macro level studies, and then
Yeah.
CenterWatch was going out and talking to sites. What do you think about
Oh,
the results of
yes. Yeah.
research? And so that was kind of a cool synergy
That's
that
a cool it's a cool synergy, but it's also brilliant from a business standpoint, right? Because you also, you have an interest in getting the Tufts data out there and to be able to leverage both in a way that's not a conflict of interest is really smart. Yeah.
Thank you, Patty. The hardest part was that when I sold CenterWatch the first time, it was during the dot-com craze, and
Hmm.
Thomson really thought they were buying a dot-com company. CenterWatch had the clinical trials listing service, right?
I see.
When I bought it back, the whole world had migrated away from premium priced, closed circulation newsletters to free content on the internet.
Uh-huh.
So I really had to find a totally different business model to get CenterWatch to scale and to find relevance again in the marketplace. That was not
So interesting. So I know we're running out of time. I almost feel like we need a part two of this conversation because I have so many more
Yeah.
questions. But
Well, this was
um,
a lot of fun.
I did want to ask you just a final question because I know you're so passionate about patient participation in trials um, and investigational sites and the sort of the health of that whole community. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense for the future over the next, say, 5 years when we think about the site world. And given all the things that are happening now with just in the political landscape, with cutting back on funding, and do you have a sense of where what the future holds for sites?
I do. And, 5 years is not a very long time horizon in our industry, especially for some of these legacy structures like the investigative
Yes, true.
world. Interestingly, when at its peak, CenterWatch was covering the emergence of the SMO, the site management organization. Now, some 25 years later, and you're just starting to see site networks scaling, attracting
Yes.
private equity funding.
Yes.
That- the
Resurgence. Yeah.
so these things, I think, will
Yeah.
take such a long time to unfold, and many of the models that people assume will compete with sites like retail pharmacies or urgent care facilities, you're going to see very, very slow uptake, right? I do envision over time that sites may become more embedded within clinical care settings, or you'll see stronger synergy.
Hmm.
They won't be disparate worlds or parallel worlds that are so siloed and hardly ever even interact or share infrastructure and data. I think that you will see convergence there, but I think that the role of the site, especially a site that's really good at managing its patients and forming really valuable relationships with the patient community. That is such a sacred relationship that will always be such an important part of clinical research.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that. And Ken, we're going to get to work together at the upcoming DIA
Yeah,
meeting. I'm excited about that, and we'll be talking about challenges with vendor qualification and getting some executives to weigh in on that. So I think that'll be really fun.
yes, I do too. And obviously, an area where there's just tremendous opportunity for improvement, for efficiencies. It's just as our protocols have grown in complexity, the requirements today that we place on the selection of our vendors, that just the time and labor involved, all of that is really ripe for new solutions and opportunities to really drive a much more efficient process.
Yes, and we're seeing that in our day to day, just the challenges intensifying. And so I think it'll be really interesting to have others weigh in.
So hopefully we'll
S-
get a really good turnout at our DIA session as
I
well.
hope so too. I think we will. I think it's an interesting topic. If they don't come to see us, they'll be coming to sort of hear what people have to say about the topic. And so, well, Ken, thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation, but mostly I've enjoyed our longstanding friendship. And it's been many years now that we've known each other and have worked together on different things, and you're just one of my favorite people in the industry. So thank you.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here, and as always, to collaborate with you and really value our friendship. Thank
Likewise.
you.
Thank you.